G'day, everyone. It's Benjamin Law here, writer and co-host of ABC Radio National Stop Everything. I'm really stoked to be joining you here on Gadigal country, where I am, which is part of the Great Eora Nation. And I extend my respects to elders past and present, and that respect also goes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners who are joining us here today, courtesy of Booktopia. I'm really thrilled to be joined by the Southwest Sydney raised and now New York City based debut author of an incredible book I've been absolutely consumed by, obsessed with, devouring. This novel is a total page turning, intelligent, sophisticated thriller. It has a lot to say about race, grief, policing, and family, and it's called All That's Left Unsaid. So Tracey Lien joins me now, courtesy of Booktopia. She's in New York City. Hey, Tracey, are you there?
Hey, Benjamin. Thank you so much for
Oh
having
my
me.
gosh, I'm so stoked that I get to talk to you. Congratulations on All That's Left Unsaid. I don't know if you heard, but it's just completely taken over my life for the past week.
Hopefully in a good
Yeah, in
way.
the best possible way. I'm curious. I read that you weren't actually a big reader as a kid, but that you loved magazines. And this is something that you and I
Yeah,
have in common. So tell me about the magazines that you were reading when you were growing up.
right. So again, not that big into books as a reader, and not that big into books as a child because I was always looking for something that could scratch the storytelling itch that was easy to access. So in elementary school, it was TV. Watched so much Judge Judy, so much Ricky Lake, The Bold and the Beautiful. I was all over
Yeah.
that. And then in high school, it was Dolly magazine. And after Dolly magazine, I just kept graduating to anything I could get my hands on, whether it was Marie Claire, Cleo, Cosmo, Rolling Stone. I just loved that articles were these gateways to other worlds, to other people's stories, and oftentimes you would read something and it would stick with you, and every now and again it would change you slightly in some way. And I just loved the idea that there was a profession that was associated with that. Like, to become a journalist meant that I could tell these stories for a living and potentially have that effect on someone else.
Mm.
Um, so I was just obsessed with magazines in high school and even going into uni. Like, anytime I had any money, I would walk into a news agency and just pick one magazine from every category, just to see what was out there. But yeah, like, I want to know about your magazine obsession when you were young.
Oh, it's so funny that you're talking about this because I'm like, have you stolen my teen years, Tracy? My teen years were defined by not reading books because I feel like YA wasn't as good as it is now. So similarly to you, I raided at the news agency, and I wonder if the bottom of our beds were really, really similar. Like I was reading Rolling Stone and Juice and HQ and all of that sort of stuff. But it wasn't till later that I made the connection that, well, actually, as a big reader of this stuff, maybe this is the profession that I wanted to enter. So tell me about that journey for you. How do you go from big reader of magazines to someone who has aspirations to be a journalist to someone like you are now who is a published novelist?
So when I was 13, I remember reading my first issue of Dolly and being fascinated by the masthead, because here was a page that showed you the names of everyone who worked on this. And as I followed each month, I realized that there was career progression happening. Like, someone who started off as the editorial in January might end up as, a junior features writer 9 months later. And then a year later, they were maybe the features writer and then eventually the deputy editor. So seeing that, like, very early on, I knew that, oh, this is a career and that there is progression as well. And then I just became so single-minded. Um, Up until the point I did work experience at Dolly when I was, I think, in year 11.
Huh.
And I think that was the moment, though, when I realized, oh, I don't think I want to work at Dolly. Like, I think I've outgrown it. Um, but I still am fascinated by journalism and the media. And then so I went and studied journalism at UTS. and became interested in local papers.
Hmm.
So like the Liverpool City Champion and the Fairfield Champion, and I did work experience there. And in uni, just interned at a kids magazine at one point, at video game publications, at an art publication, at Time Out. Like, just I was open to anything.
Before we move on to your novel, I've got to ask you, while you were working at Dolly, did you ever meet Dolly Doctor?
I didn't. I don't think
Because she's
she was
Asian, you
in.
know.
Yeah, it was like Dr. Cindy Pan. Was that her or no?
No, it was Dr. Melissa Kang, actually. Dr. Cindy Pan was like an amazing kind of sex doctor as well, but Dr. Melissa Kang, it blew my mind to discover later on that Dolly Doctor was real and she was like one of us. Anyway, that's a whole other conversation. I want to get back to your novel, and if anyone's listening to us has just joined the conversation, I'm talking to novelist Tracey Lien, and the book that she's written that's just come out, it's hot off the presses, is called All That's Left Unsaid. It's a literary thriller that has garnered praise from the likes of Alice Pung and Leon Moriarty. And when you think of those two authors, you get a sense of the kind of literary kind of genres that we're straddling here. This is a page turner that's really, really sophisticated and intelligent, and has so much to say Australia, and especially Australia in the 1990s. Hey, well, while I'm talking to you, Tracey, I was a book that started off like a massive kind of bidding war, and so many publishers were keen to publish this. Eventually,
Mm-hmm.
it landed with HarperCollins. But I imagine it's part of that process of you talking about the novel. You had to really pitch for your life. So, for people who haven't come across you and your book just yet, what is the elevator pitch for this novel?
Well, All That's Left Unsaid is set in Cabramatta in the year 1996, and the story begins when a 17-year-old boy is murdered at a busy Cabramatta restaurant. And when his older sister, Key, who's a journalist, returns home for the funeral, she learns that the police are completely stumped by her brother's case. There were about a dozen witnesses present, and they all claimed to have seen nothing. So she takes it upon herself to track down each witness to find out what happened, and the story is told from both her point of view and also the points of view of the witnesses who were there.
Oh, that is a crisp pitch. Like, that's not even under a minute, and I'm completely sold. Key has a quest, right? You know, Key has this quest to find out the truth of what happened to her brother. As you're reading the book, you also get an incredible portrait of a family in grief, and also of a very particular part of the city at a very particular time. I'm curious, where was the seed of this book for you? What did you actually start with? Was it the character of Denny, of Key? Was it the place of Cabramatta? Was it this mystery that needed to be solved?
So it started with a goal of wanting people to know how it feels. And what I mean by that was when I was at the University of Kansas, I was writing a lot of short stories. And a classmate pointed out to me, "Oh, your stories all connected." And I said, "Huh, what makes you say that?" And my classmate said, "Well, they're all from the point of view of sort of young girls or women in this place called Cabramatta in the 90s. And they all seem to be struggling with a sense of belonging." Um, and so it was sort of a light bulb moment for me that I was circling something, but what was it? And I settled on, oh, I want people to know how it feels. And what does that mean? Well, I want people to know how it feels to have grown up Asian in Australia in the 90s. And what does that mean then?
Mm,
And I think it comes down to wanting to challenge the myth of the model minority. I grew up in Australia in the 90s and the early 2000s, where as a kid, from a very young age, you're as Aussie as they come. You belong, you're fair income, every Aussie gets a fair go.
mm.
And I bought into that with such great intensity as a kid. Like, I knew both verses of the national anthem. I could sing it so loud. And like, who knows the second verse? I did. And I think at some point realizing, oh, what I was told as a child wasn't quite true, that
Mm.
my citizenship was actually conditional. It was conditional on my impeccable behavior. It was conditional on my gratitude. And if I ever did anything to step out of line, then I risked being perceived as a nuisance or worse, as a threat. And I think to arrive at that realization is just so deeply disappointing. And so I really wanted to capture that. And knowing that I was going to write a story that had these heavy themes, I also wanted to be entertaining, because
Mm,
I didn't want my novel to feel like homework. Like there are certain types of novels that you look at and you're like, I should read it. I should definitely buy it. I'll have it on my shelf and I'll get to it when I'm in the mood for it. But yeah, they just sit like unread. And I was just really cognizant of the fact that if I'm writing something that could be very heavy for readers, then the least I can the least I can do is try to make this entertaining as well. So that was definitely like my thinking, when I approached this book.
mm. Tracy, you and I both grew up as Asian kids in Australia in the 90s. And what you're talking about when it comes to this conditional acceptance of us being Australians really resonates with me. At the same time, I grew up in a really different part of Australia. And I feel like so many of those conversations were concentrated, boiled down, and focused matter specifically, which is where you set your novel and which is where the story takes place. Cabramatta is, if you caught a train there in that period, I believe it was known as taking, quote, the heroin express. It had a reputation. It's the site of Australia's first political assassination. MP John Newman, an anti-drug campaigner, was gunned down outside his home in 1994. And there was a lot of moral panic about race and specifically the Vietnamese Australian community. So for those of us who weren't in Cabramatta or weren't familiar with Cabramatta in the 1990s, take us back.
I think each person's experience of Cabramatta is going to be different depending on what they were exposed to. So much of the reporting about Cabramatta in the 90s concerned gangs and violent crime and the heroin trade. And that was all real. It was definitely the heroin capital of Australia during that time. But a lot of people, yeah, for a lot of people, it was just home as well. And you could live there and be aware of everything that was happening and not be directly affected by it all the time. And so that was sort of my family's position where, we were always in Cabramatta. And I knew, okay, don't use the public toilet. And before you sit down on anything, check for syringes. Um, and so, like, as a kid, that was the extent of my thinking about it. But it definitely varied for a lot of people. And, I think for those whose lives were directly affected by the gangs or the crime or the drugs, they would have had a much more harrowing experience of Cabramatta compared to me and my family.
Mm. You live in Brooklyn in New York City nowadays, MFA at the University of Kansas. You worked at the Los Angeles Times as a reporter. And I'm curious, being based in the United States now, did the distance from Australia, from Cabramatta, did that help or hinder you capturing the sense of what it felt like, as you say, to be in this place and in this time? And what did you notice about the place looking back, kind of now as an outsider looking in?
I definitely needed the distance in order to write about Cabramatta and to tell this story. One of the lines I do a lot is that it's really hard to read the label from inside the jar.
Mm,
And, I've been in America for nearly 10 years now, but I think back to when I was living in Australia, it was very hard for me to think critically about Australia because it was my home and I had work. And if I had spent any time reflecting on discrimination or unfairness or the myth of the model minority, I would have feared, thinking myself into a downward spiral. And that was really scary. And I think when I moved to America, even within my first 5 years here, I was living in Oakland, California, which is right next to San Francisco, and so very multicultural, multiracial. I didn't think about it too much. And then it was when I moved to Kansas. And Kansas is a bit more of a homogenous area. Lawrence, Kansas is a very white city, that I was sort of forced to like address my feelings. When you walk into a classroom or you walk into a restaurant and a non-white person,
mm,
it makes you of certain feelings. And I was like, oh, this is connected to something though. I have felt this way before. What is that? And it was when I began interrogating those feelings that I sort of dredged up so much of my feelings about Australia that I had repressed.
mm,
Um, And it was just so complicated because I think of Australia as home. It's the only home I've ever known. It's a place I have such great fondness and affection for, but it's also a place where I've seen my loved ones get hurt, and it's a place where I've been hurt as well. And sometimes just it's a matter of like opening like the Sydney Morning Herald or the Australian, and there'll be a headline, and it's like, oh, that hurts too.
Mm.
Sometimes it's just right there in front of you. So yeah, I think having the distance allowed me to reflect, and then allowed me to process, and then to think critically. This place that I have so much love for and also have such complicated feelings about.
Mm. For those of you who are just tuning in and listening in, you're listening to me, Benjamin Law, writer and co-host of ABC Radio National's Stop Everything, and I'm talking to Tracey Lien, who's the author of the debut book, a novel called All That's Left Unsaid, which has been described as a literary thriller that's been getting praised by Alice Pong and Lian Moriarty and many, many others, and has been keeping me awake at night in bed to the point of exhaustion from my partner who wants the lights off. It's that kind of book that will keep you way awake past midnight. So you were talking about, you were feeling those connections to feelings that you hadn't really felt in a while as you were kind of like navigating this world of writing this book. And, when I've been reading All That's Left Unsaid, I feel the trademark of a really great book, a really great novel, is that it was both timeless and timely. And in some ways, it's timeless because you're writing about the past, you're writing about the 1990s. And in other ways, it felt time in that you're kind of capturing a world where policing of crime isn't uniform and there are a lot of shortcomings in policing. That's definitely a conversation we've been having in Australia when it comes to Black Lives Matter, of course, in America, where that movement really started. It's also a book that's been looking at the disparity in terms of race and racism, and especially in the United States, you'd be feeling quite palpably the wave of anti-Asian hate crimes that have been happening that has led to movements like Stop Asian Hate. And I'm curious, after you finished writing the book and as you've started having conversations with readers about the book, what are the modern day resonances that you're finding in what you've written, even though it's a story about the past?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you raised the point about the recent anti-Asian hate crimes in America, because when a lot of that was happening, a lot of people in America expressed surprise, like, oh, we can't believe, we can't fathom that, the Asian Americans are being targeted now. They've always been the good minorities, right?
Mm.
They've always been the ones who were left alone. But I don't think anyone of Asian descent was surprised at all, because we have lived with these, I guess, daily paper cuts, these regular moments of dehumanization, because that's what it is. Um, and the natural conclusion for the dehumanization of an entire group of people is violence.
Mm.
And I think a lot of what I depict, All That's Left Unsaid, is kind of the spectrum of dehumanization. On one end, yes, it can be a violent crime that results in murder, but on the other end of the spectrum, it's stuff like confusing two Asian people for each
Mm.
other. It's being made fun of for your accent. It's being made fun of for your food, or the way you look, or just being stereotyped in a certain way. Like, all Asian women, we're quiet, we're docile, we're hardworking, we're any number of things, but we're not human. And so I think that is why the book has resonated with a lot of readers, even though it's set in 1996. It's because it depicts the dehumanization that still happens on a daily basis in America and in Australia.
This book you've written, this novel, All That's Left Unsaid, captures and embodies all of those big themes and big conversations that we're still, unfortunately, still having now. At the same time, you mentioned before that you didn't want this book to feel like homework, and this is a real page turner, and it's a multi perspective page turner. We said before that it follows Key Tran as she's investigating her 17-year-old brother Denny's death and what happened at this restaurant where there were a dozen witnesses but no one speaking. At the same time, we go into the lives and perspectives of the character there at the site of the crime, and it reads so effortlessly. But I wonder what the writing process is of constructing a page turner like this. Did you map it out? Did you have an Excel spreadsheet? How do you even begin putting this multi perspective book together?
I am not a planner or an outliner at all. And I use this rather convoluted housing construction analogy to explain how I wrote this all. So I think of my first draft as me deciding, oh, I want to build a house.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not qualified in the slightest, but I've lived in a house and I've seen houses. So in writing this novel, in doing my first draft, I'm going to build a house. And so I go out and I build something that vaguely resembles a house. And that's my first draft. And I realize that it is not structurally sound at all, and it is about to collapse and kill someone. So draft 2 is going in and reinforcing it, like putting in a load-bearing wall and whatever else someone uses to build a house. And then, okay, so draft 2, okay, it's looking like a house, it's structurally sound, but now I'm going in for draft 3 and I'm realizing, oh, there's no plumbing. I didn't put in any pipes or wires. So now I'm tearing down walls to put in the plumbing and the place looks like a disaster. And then in the subsequent few drafts, I'm going in with like spackle and drywall and paint and making it look all pretty so that by draft, I don't know, 8, 9, 10, someone walks in and they're like, wow, you built this house all by yourself? and I'm flicking my hair going like, yeah, what of it? But only I know what a hot mess it was to get to this stage. So yeah, I wish I was a planner. Like I remember Jane Harper visited Kansas on book tour a few years ago, and I remember sitting in the audience and someone had asked the question about her process, and she'd said something to the effect of she'll spend several months outlining down to the scene, and then she'll just write it. And then that's how she's been able to have an international bestseller every year. And I was like, oh, that sounds simple. And then I tried it myself, and it was messy from start to finish.
I love that to explain literary process. You have adopted the language of Australia's obsession, which is real estate and renovation. That's incredibly helpful, Tracey. You mentioned Jane Harper, and I'm really curious about who your influences and inspirations are. When people have been reading your novel, All That's Left Unsaid, they've been comparing it to Celeste Ng and her work, Everything I Never Told You. They've been comparing it to Britt Bennett's The Mothers. Where do you draw your inspiration from when it comes to approaching your work?
So many places. So Jane Harper was a huge source of inspiration. And in fact, if you read the first line of The Dry, there's something about that just like really inspired me and made me think really hard about the first line of my novel. So the first line of my novel is the circumstances of Denny Tran's death were so violent that the people of Cabramatta were to attend his funeral. And if I've done like a side-by-side comparison between my first line and hers, and I just feel like I totally ripped her off in some ways. So yeah, definitely
she's not
Jane
setting
Harper.
her work in Cabramatta, so it's not direct.
Right. But it was more like I think like the rhythm and the cadence and like the gist, like the hook, like the first line of The Dry hooks you. And so I was definitely inspired by that because, again, wanting this to be entertaining, The Dry was a book that I inhaled in less than a day. And everything she writes seems to have that effect on people. So I was like, okay, here is an author who has a lot to teach. I also love the work of Viet Thanh Nguyen and how he isn't afraid of intellect. He isn't afraid of tackling the big issues while also being entertaining as well. The Sympathizer is about colonialism and imperialism and the war in Vietnam. And it's a spy novel. So, he shows that you can do it all. Your authors like Trent Dalton as well. I remember when I first started writing All That's Left Unsaid, I was a little self-conscious about setting a novel in Cabramatta. I knew it had to be in Cabramatta, but there was a small part of me that worried, but like, what if no one cares? What if no one knows what Cabramatta is and they don't care? And then I read Boyspoller's universe, and his novel is set in Darra, in Bracken Ridge, like suburban Brisbane, in places like I heard of, and I didn't really care about until I read the story through his character's eyes. And because he and his characters cared about the place, I cared about the place, and it emboldened me, to really double down on Cabramatta. So I'm drawing inspiration from so many people and probably just ripping them off in various ways.
I hear what you're saying about, your worry that a very specific location won't necessarily resonate. Your book has now been out for over a month in the United States. And of course, it's out here in Australia, All That's Left Unsaid. What have been the more surprising or memorable reactions from readers that have stayed with you so far?
I think what's been really lovely is hearing readers who might not necessarily share a similar ethnic background to me find that the story has been relatable to them. I had one reader who is Lebanese Australian who felt that the myth of the model minority and conditional citizenship applied to their experience as well. I've heard from like Asian Americans who find what the characters go through quite relatable, and I think that's really satisfying because your toughest audience is going to be people who have sort of been through what you're writing about, because they can call out whether or not it feels authentic. And so to hear from Asian Australians and Asian Americans and other of people of color, and to know that what I've written sort of rings true for a lot of them. While it's both sad that that's been our shared realities, to know that, a lot of them feel seen, and by extension feel less alone about what they've experienced.
Mm. Hey, Tracey, we're going to wrap up soon. But before we do, you mentioned before that when you were studying writing, people noticed that a lot of your stories were set in the same place, with similar characters. And it makes me think that, are you constructing some sort of like Tracey Lien cinematic universe? You've also got a 2-book deal, I understand. I have to ask, what is next for you?
So I am working on another novel, and I think I'm sort of constructing like the Southwest Sydney cinematic universe. So like I imagine that they'll just be we'll be revisiting this area. If not Cabramatta, then if you know the area, then you'll know what to expect probably.
And maybe if we look out closely, maybe Key Tran will actually make a cameo appearance in the background, right?
Yeah, that would be fun.
Hey, Tracey, thank you so much for making the time to talk about your debut novel, Left Unsaid. I've loved the book and loved talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been great.
Well, thank you to Tracey, and thank you for everyone who's just been listening in and joining us here on behalf of Booktopia. Be sure to tag your friends and family in the tweet comments if you think they'd like to learn more. And just before we let you go, finally, Tracey, can you tell everyone how we can read, hear more of you? I mean, your book's out now, but if we want to know more about you and your work, where should we go?
My Instagram handle is Hello Tracey Lien, and you can also visit my website, which is traceylien.com.
Fantastic. And if you listening in have enjoyed this chat, you can get a copy of Tracey's debut book, All That's Left Unsaid, right now from booktopia.com.au. Thank you so much for joining us, folks. It's been really, really great to have you here. And until next time, we'll see you then. But thank you so much. And it's been great joining you, Tracey. Take care.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.